Thank you for inviting me here. I don't get up to Boston too much, but it's home for you, right, Derek?
It's been for a while. I'm not born here, but I've been here quite some time.
Yeah.
25 years or something.
25 years. You've been, this is actually where I wanted to start, so perfect segue. You've been in the Boston tech scene. You've been building companies in and around the Boston tech scene, I think since early 2000, right? But you didn't start in crypto. You kind of started just in the, I say trad tech, maybe? Is that a term? Walk us through where you started and how you got into crypto.
Yeah, I've been building software companies in Boston like my whole career, so that is since the late 90s. Notably, the Boston company people may know is a company called Fuse. I was one of the co-founders there. That built up to be a pretty significant size company in the Boston area.
Is that a cloud communications company?
It's in cloud communication, so
okay.
Mostly like not blockchain, like for most of my career, but obviously starting in 2019 in the blockchain space. I was the founder of a project called Moonbeam, which is a EVM compatible parachain deployed on the Polkadot network, and from there a lot of other Web3 related initiatives that I've been working on.
Cool. When you think about Web 2 and obviously working in constructing Web3 infrastructure now, what are the biggest differences? And I guess what are some of can you bring initiatives that you learn from Web 2 into building Web3 infrastructure? There are any things that you can learn and sort of translate? Does anything translate?
Yeah, of course. I mean, and it's changed over time, right? I mean, I was reflecting on this earlier that we're in a moment now where I think a lot of just traditional company building ideas and kind of requirements are coming to the fore again, right? But when it comes to basics of company building, of having doing a great job recruiting, in Web3 has always tended towards this tech-heavy focus. But I think we're in a moment now where that's shifting back. People understand that you need to have a great company. It's not enough to have just tech, right? You need great marketing, great go-to-market, and BD. And so I think a lot of those lessons were ones that were quite helpful. Having been like a previous tech entrepreneur coming into Web3, to kind of have that kind of outlook versus this, hey, we'll build the tech and people will come.
Yeah. And then from comms, or I guess like tech comms, how did you get into crypto specifically? I believe that your partner at Fuse was an early starter in Algorand. Am I correct?
That's right.
That?
So my co-founder.
Is that how you got the bug?
Yeah. So my co-founder from Fuse, a guy named Steve Kokinos, so worked with him for many years, and then he left to become the CEO of the original CEO of the project Algorand, which is one of the big Boston blockchain projects, L1. And that's really what got me interested initially. So that was back in 2018 or so is when that was happening, 2017, 2018.
Mm-hmm. And then you started Moonbeam.
So basically started working on the project Moonbeam, and obviously that was diving into the pool, like both feet first, because that was a L1 blockchain, building an Ethereum implementation, like using a novel technology substrate. Then all of the things that go along with creating a project, right? So that's building a community, understanding all these DeFi and other use cases, and there's quite a bit of learning happened in that through that process.
And from a founder's perspective, when you're building these Web3 infrastructures, what makes a interface usable but also actually enjoyable for a user to use, right? I mean, I think a lot of the problem in Web3 has been sort of these user interface and how it's a bit clunky, maybe a little bit just difficult to get comfortable with. How do you go about, especially as someone who's been at the forefront of this, but also someone who comes from a tech background and has seen the beginning and the end of this?
Yeah, I think it's a good question because usability, I would say, is at the heart of adoption, right? People are always saying, well, I need more users, like how do I get more users? And a lot of it does come down to the UX and usability you're able to offer. And I think there's been, historically a pretty big tension point in building Web3 products where kind of decentralization and usability are sometimes at odds with each other, right? So you have a choice in the road, you're like, okay, well, if I do this is kind of making it maximally decentralized, but maybe there's a trade-off against usability. And I think you see it, right? In our space, it tends to be that the centralized products are the ones that have the most users in them, right? Because they are able to offer the best user experience. I think that's changing now, though, right? Where we're in an interesting moment now where I think people are adopting a more pragmatic mindset, right? So even if you have, let's say, a protocol you're building, I think people are much more willing these days to say, hey, let's maybe it's okay to be a little bit hybrid state. Like maybe there's certain components that are centralized, but So yes, while there's some trust assumptions there, if we're able to make like a vastly better user experience, well, that's worth it. And I think of an example like Hyperliquid, for example, right? Like it could fall into this category. So I mean, to me, that's like progress, that like people are having this much more pragmatic mindset and not saying, hey, like it's kind of all or nothing. We either are decentralized or not at all, and and we're going to live or die on that hill. That's not that helpful when you're trying to just get users, right? And many of whom don't really care that much about the degree of decentralization that's in the underlying platform. And so just having this pragmatic mindset, and that's lessons that were very important for me in like building products in the regular Web 2 space is, just the attention and detail that goes into, building a great user experience. That takes like a lot, it takes a lot of energy and effort. Mm-hmm. And so, if you're going to make a product that's competitive, like with these other centralized solutions, you have to have that kind of mindset. Mm-hmm. And I just don't think, in general, users aren't like that willing to give up on usability, for these principles, like decentralization. Mm-hmm. So, this pragmatic mindset these days, I think, is actually healthy and a good thing.
What applications would you say have really good usability right now? I guess aside from the pragmatic approach of Hyperliquid that you just mentioned, what would you say?
Yeah, I mean, if I think about it, it's UX, but it's also feature sets, right? So, I mean, just from the news in the last week, you have this announcement of Tempo, right? The new kind of L1, Stripe and Paradigm are working on it. They were just tweeting about some of the features there. And you can see that some of the features are, they are not the features necessarily that, like, if you're kind of a decentralization maximalist, like you would be talking about, right? Mm-hmm. But they're pragmatic. So it's things like, how do I prioritize payments so they don't get swamped by, other use cases like on the chain, right? This noisy neighbors problem. How can I like offer compliance features, right? Like, for example, if like accounts need to be frozen, or maybe like rollbacks have to happen. And so this to me is again a sign that we're entering into like a more mature stage where there's just practical requirements that these big companies have that they're just not going to use the technology unless they can like meet those requirements. Mm-hmm. And so to me, I know it can be a divisive point because people are saying, hey, like I got into the space for different reasons. This doesn't feel good, but I think this is what adoption looks like, right? I mean, this is what like making mainstream products looks like. And you have to be able to meet these requirements to, get these big players to move. And so
that's a great point I wanted to bring up actually later in the conversation, but let's do it now. Crypto, has it matured? I mean, you've been in the space a long time now. I think Congress has been making some laws, right? We've seen the Trump administration warm to the sector. I think it is, the SEC now has sort of taken on the approach that, okay, crypto is good. It's not this pariah, it's not this pariah sector anymore. AI is also a complement to crypto. Do you think it's mature enough where, we can perhaps integrate this into the wider financial system now, and it's grown up enough where, maybe we're past all those scandals of FTX and Three Arrows and, everything that we saw in the crypto winter of 2022, are we past that?
Oh, but I think so. I would say so. I mean, for me, the moment we're in now, obviously there's a lot of interest and traction at this intersection of TradFi and Web3. I see that again as like a healthy thing. Practical, this mindset of practicality. What do I need to do to build a product that is, as good or better than existing alternatives out there? These are all like signs of maturation to me. The fact that these big players with big distribution channels are coming in, that's going to open the door to larger numbers of users coming into the space. When you have someone like a Robinhood that's building a chain, that is like inherently different than like a startup, like a Web3 native startup. They have like a very large user base. So does Stripe. So do a lot of the other players that are coming in. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I think for Boston, this is like a good thing. Boston is well positioned for this kind of thing, given like its roots and having a lot of these traditional companies that have been Web3 oriented for a long time.
Mm-hmm. So, like a Fidelity, like a State Street.
Like a Fidelity, right? Yeah. I mean, I talked to a guy from Fidelity who was talking about how you pay in Bitcoin in their cafeteria like 10 years ago, right? So this is like,
right.
They've been like on this for a long time.
Yeah. From a founder's perspective, from your personal perspective, how has anything changed, in your business? Have you had any conversations with the SEC? Has anything changed in the last year at Moonsong? Moonbeam?
Yeah, I mean, on the kind of the regulatory like landscape and the changes there. I mean, the thing that I think is most important is that kind of the signal that like, hey, it's okay to be a Web3 founder, right? I mean, for a long time, if you're a US person building a Web3 project, I think, given some of the events you're talking about, that became, not something you would even like mention or talk about, right? And so I think what it led to is basically a dearth of like good quality founders that were, US based, which is weird because you look at other tech sectors, other areas, other software areas, it's dominated by US founders. And so, I think that makes me bullish for the future. I mean, if you looked at, like, for example, Electric Capital had a report from last year that was mapping out where founders were from that were starting Web3 projects, and the majority was from, like, Europe or Asia. That's not, like, normal, right? Like, I would say that in most other cases, it would be led by, like, North America and by American entrepreneurs. So I think that, it takes time, though, right? So, like, kind of you lift the veil, new founders come up with ideas, they realize, hey, like, Web3 makes sense as a technology to use in my solution. And I expect that that's like happening now, right? There's like, more US-based founders that are doing that now. So we'll see that like as a tailwind, going into next year.
Do you think Wall Street is going to pull that slowness of crypto, crypto kind of lagging in the US? Do you think Wall Street's going to kind of pull that into the future a little bit? Maybe pull it up into, the same level of Europe and Asia?
I mean, I just think that when the opportunity is there, like, we're enterprising people, right? There'll be founders that'll step in to fill that. And it's being, you can see now all the activity that's happening, that the opportunity is there. I think people are realizing, again, from this pragmatic mindset, like, where is it that Web3 makes sense? Where is it that, like, I can apply this technology in a way that makes for a better product? Mm-hmm. Obviously, like, right now, stable coins would be like one area where I think that's like pretty much conventional wisdom now, even if you go into the IT departments or the strategy departments of these big banks and other places. It's just like, it's objectively better, compared to like legacy tech stacks for a lot of reasons.
Mm-hmm. And then in Boston specifically, did you see any exiting of founders or, Web3 builders here? Or was it largely sort of, okay, we're just going to build quietly?
I guess, Boston has been, perhaps influenced by like the financial institutions that have been here, so it's had this institutional bent always.
Yeah, kind of a shield.
Yeah, there are some, there obviously are like teams, a lot of them coming out of like the universities that we have here, but probably less than like New York or San Francisco. But yeah, it's like I think there is a scene here. There are definitely like other, L1, L2 founders, or protocol founders that I know that are in the area. But I would say that it's, obviously this institutional kind of like vibe is a little bit of the scene here.
Yeah. All right, let's switch gears. I want to get into sort of the venture side of your life as well. You've built a lot of companies, but you've also had a hand in building up a lot of companies as well. What goes into those decisions for you personally when you see a company and you think, okay, yes, this is a company I want to incubate and see through until the end? I guess maybe two things that you say, this is why.
I'll answer two ways. I mean, one are kind of the obvious answers that's true of any company building, right? I mean, you need to have, a great like market, like, assemble a great team and other things. But there are some Web3 specific things, I'd mention.
Yeah.
And actually, before I go there, I mean, I would say that this, this advice I often give is around, making sure to start with like the customer and work your way backwards, right? So there's a lot of enthusiastic Web3 founders I talk to or help advise. Many of them are often starting with the tech first and saying, hey, there's this, this ZK technology is amazing. Like, I'm going to build this, like, this tech. But, in my experience, it's much, much better if you start with, like, the customer and what problem they're having first and work your way backwards to the tech solution. And so that's, a frequent point of advice that I'm giving, like, younger founders or, like, people starting new things. Yeah, I'd say in Web3, though, the question that we've often been asking ourselves at Moonsong, since we're one of the things we do is we're a venture studio, helping launch projects, like, incubating and helping launch projects. The question is, like, where does Web3 make sense, right? And often it's kind of shoehorned in, maybe, there's interest in, hey, let's launch a token, let's shoehorn this thing in, but it doesn't really make sense. And, I think the market's in a state now where that's going to quickly get, like, flushed out, right? You're not going to make it very far if it isn't like truly making sense. You're not actually getting like real customer traction that's organic. That's like, there's only so far that like will take you these days. And there's a few patterns that we've found that I think are relevant. Obviously, there's this payments area. That's one thing. But like multi-sided marketplaces. So using Web3 as a kind of coordination mechanism to match two sides of a market. I think that's another idea that's quite solid. If you think of DePIN as effectively like that formulation of Web3. Kind of this idea of like verifiability, right? So being able to publicly verify different kinds of actions, that's and we'll talk about it later, I think. But in the realm of AI, I think that's a pretty fruitful area of research for us right now.
Yeah. Let's go to AI. I think for at least this past year, maybe even two, AI and the intersection of blockchain was this big buzzword, right? Do you still feel like it's that way? Was it maybe overhyped for a little bit? Is it still that way?
Yeah, I mean, kind of this first wave of like influencer agents, I would say, in some ways was overhyped and then and then fell out of favor. But I mean, to me, so just for context, like we have an AI lab at Moonsong. We've been spending quite a bit of time working in the AI sector, learning that set of like tools and skills to be able to apply to new ventures. And look, I mean, AI agents, like they are going to change like the way things work. They already are changing the way we operate. So even the software development we do is now heavily like using AI agents, to automate like many different things that used to be manual. And I would say we're at a moment right now where a lot of that experimentation automation is happening internally in companies, but it's soon going to evolve to the point where there is like external like interactions between companies, between AI agents. And that's I think an exciting opportunity. That's a place where blockchain actually has like some really cool things to offer. Because when you're if you're inside of a company, well, you can trust kind of like the actions of the agents that are also agents that are working for you, right? Directly working for you. Mm-hmm. It becomes different when you're not in control of the agents, right? And you're interacting with other agents that are over the internet. Then that's like a different kind of mindset, right? That's more of like a business mindset of, hey, I'm taking on a new partner. Does this make sense? You'd normally be in a contract. You're contracting with them. Hey, I want to like mitigate my risks. It's a different set of considerations there.
So, do you see a future where AI is building its own blockchain, or is it always going to be sort of AI built on top of blockchains?
Yeah, I mean,
I feel like there's endless possibilities, right? When it comes to AI, you can think of anything really.
They're complementary technologies, but to put kind of like AI computation directly on a blockchain doesn't work for a lot of reasons, right? It's very computationally expensive. Blockchains are like quite, they have a lot of great features, but computational throughput is like not one of those features, so they're quite slow. So the idea is to find like complementary like ways that those two technologies can work together. Mm-hmm. So as an example, and I think it was mentioned before here on one of the previous talks, this area of like employing AI agents to kind of be your agent to perform on-chain actions, that's a pretty fruitful area. So like we are working with a number of different like customers pursuing projects in this area. There's a lot of DeFi oriented agents these days, right? And the idea is pretty simple of, hey, like instead of a human interacting directly with these complex DeFi protocols, let's create an agent that understands how to interact with those DeFi protocols. And now as a user, I can interact with the agent in a much simpler way, right? I say, hey, here's like the goal I have, here's the kinds of outcomes I want, here's my risk tolerances. And the agent will translate those like high-level intents into like low-level actions on the blockchain. So you're kind of using the AI as an abstraction layer to make it easier to work with blockchains. And kind of almost circling back to the point about how do you make the usability better. AI is like one way to do that.
Out of all your venture projects that you invest in right now, what percentage of them would you say are focused on AI?
Pretty much all of them at this
all
point.
Of them?
Yeah. I mean, pretty much all of them. So, I mean, the things that we spend a lot of time thinking about are, what kinds of like decentralized infrastructure are genuinely useful to agents, and on the forward vision of something I've heard people call the agent economy, right? So it's like once there's agents that are interacting with each other across the internet, across like company boundaries, I'm a firm believer that's going to be a massive, massive market, right? A lot of economic activity is going to move to that model. And so the question is then, what kinds of infrastructure do those agents need? I think that's like a very, very big opportunity.
It's mind-blowing.
It's happening now, right? It's happening pretty quickly.
I know.
So,
it's wild. I want to switch gears as well to talk about what's going on with interoperability on chain, because with Moonbeam, that was kind of the reason you launched Moonbeam, right? Was to be able to go between chains and have an EVM compatible chain on Polymarket. I think for a long time the mantra in crypto was like the future is interoperability. Do you still see that as the future? Is the future still multi-chain? Even though we talked about this before going on stage, there is some consolidation going on.
Yeah.
What's your thought?
Yeah, I kind of answer that question as both yes and no. So the nuance is this, that there's really like strong consolidation happening now. I think of it in terms of not just chains, but of tech stacks, right? So when it comes to tech stacks, and by tech stack I mean things like the EVM tech stack that was born on Ethereum mainnet, and let's say take Solana, right? Solana's SVM model. Those are tech stacks. There's major consolidation already that's like happening, right? So I would say that people are generally choosing either EVM or Solana. I would say that's the majority of like new projects. You're going to have this choice, with larger projects choosing both and saying, hey, I want to cover both markets. I mean, to me, that rhymes with a lot of like the history of technology, right? There's only so many tech platforms that a given market will support. So if you look at mobile, for example, there was once many platforms. Now there's effectively two. And the reason is simple, that if you're like a vendor trying to support users on a mobile platform, there's only so many platforms you can support, right? I mean, I think two is pretty much the limit of like where it's reasonable to ask a company to create two versions of their software. And so same thing playing out like here in the blockchain space, where I think it's already kind of clear to me that it's EVM and SVM are effectively the two platforms. Now the nuances within that, though, obviously like EVM is not just one chain. There's many chains that are implementing the EVM. And you can see from these recent announcements we just talked about that a lot of these new players want to control the tech stack, their deployment like end to end. So they're either launching L1s in some cases, not even L2s. So I think that's going to continue. But with this like EVM programming model, it's very difficult to launch a new tech stack that has like a whole ecosystem of dev tools and other things around it. So I think that ship has kind of sailed at this point, and you're looking at least these two as the main tech stacks out there.
I was listening to you on a podcast actually with the Wolf of All Streets in 2022, so 3 years ago now. And I remember he said, I don't think interoperability is all there yet. And you said that's a fair assessment. And you guys were talking about how at the time, obviously this was around FTX time and crypto winter, but he was characterizing the interoperability for a bunch of the security lapses that we'd been seeing at the time. Do you think those are, for the most part, getting fixed? Are we seeing security lapses around interoperability, or is it a little bit better these days?
I mean, from my perspective, actually, like the number of like security incidents and like on smart contract levels have gotten like dramatically better. So I think that's a result of better tools, better like experience like from the developer side, like more mature auditing, like like ecosystems. It's not to say that they don't happen, but the frequency with which those are happening is definitely less, demonstrably. Like if you compare now versus 3-4 years ago. But yeah, on this cross-chain thing, like so, I think the reality is we're going to be and continue to be in like there's going to be ever more chains, even if they're consolidated from a tech stack perspective. And the question is, okay, like what does that mean for the user experience? And here, like I'd say take AI agents, right? So one vector I see for creating abstraction is, insofar as you're delegating like what you want to do to an AI agent, it can in turn connect to many different blockchains to satisfy that request. So that's like a vector where you're kind of you're creating a cross-chain like scenario, or you're kind of abstracting away like cross-chain complexities. You're doing so through an AI agent, though, and there is some trust assumption happening there, but that's a very likely path, that I see like to get traction moving forward, given the utility of these agents, right, and how much they're able to do.
Do you think that might contribute to maybe one day in the future we just aren't going to really know what chain we're interacting on and transacting on? It might just kind of blend, maybe sort of like cloud infrastructure these days. It kind of just all becomes gravy at the end of the day.
Yeah, potentially. I mean, I think the trick is that is like the security trust assumptions tend to not be the same across different chains, or even across even if you're on Ethereum, different L2s have different security assumptions. So that's the trick, where they're not all the same. So thus, if you're executing different kinds of cross-chain actions, you get a different risk profile. You have to kind of sum the risks across the different hops that you're doing. But on the other hand, I think this is the kind of task that an AI agent's like pretty good at, right? So if it understands kind of the landscape, the risk landscape, it can kind of have an internal risk module that's like computing kind of the level of risk, across these different moves. And so that's an area that I think and that ties in with work we're doing these days, on AI agents as they get more sophisticated and kind of factoring in more dimensions into their analysis.
So you're bullish on AI, where we are in the AI cycle right now?
I mean, it's hard to find someone where they're not like starting to use these tools more and more and more in their daily life.
Yeah.
And, yeah.
What about Web3 in general? I mean, it's kind of like if you were to describe Web3, like where we are we sort of in the, I guess, the early phase, the mid phase, the late phase?
I mean, to me, as I was mentioning at the beginning, I think we're at like a maturation stage like right now. So,
Okay.
a lot of the early idealism, I think, is like, a little bit being challenged. You have like new players coming in that are practically minded, right? They're like, hey, I'm trying to build a product. I have all these users. Like, where is it that I can, Web3 makes sense for certain use cases. Let me use that as a technology. That's healthy in my mind, though. I think that like when it comes to projects, right, there's like different kind of questions you get from VCs if you're trying to raise now, right? I mean, I can tell you back in, 2019, 2020, there wasn't, there was, hey, is the team good? Does it make sense? Like the kind of question you get now is like, okay, who are your customers? Like, what revenue do you have? Like, I was talking to like a founder the other day who was kind of lamenting to me. It's like, like all these like kind of pain in the ass questions I'm getting now. It's like, welcome to the real world. This is like what it's like to just build an actual product, and that's what the experience you'd have if you were trying to raise money to build like a company in like, in some other space. So to me, that's healthy that's happening now in Web3, right? That's the bar is like raised, and that's what we need.
And what advice would you give to young builders and founders maybe who are sitting here in this audience today who want to build something like a Moonbeam or a Moonsong that are following the same path that you did in 2019, but obviously it's a little bit different in 2025. What would you say to them?
I mean, for me, the principles kind of stay the same. Like, and I mentioned it before. I mean, to me, like probably the most important piece of advice is, when you're trying to figure out what to build, start with like the customer and understanding their problem, and like work your way backwards to like what the solution needs to look like. I think just that alone, like that's probably the most common kind of challenge I see is people start with a tech that they're excited with, which is great. I mean, you want to be excited about the tech, but then they're trying to like map that tech back to like customers and problems, sometimes more successfully, sometimes not as successfully. And look, I think, you just need to start with the customer and the problem, and obviously like the market, right? Like something that's going to be a big market. It's very hard to change those things like after the fact. And, usually the tech solution will present itself then, right? And,
all right, and I have to ask you this because this was on our like little rundown on the agenda, but what does the mainstream media get wrong when it comes to blockchain? And I want to ask you this because I used to be part of the mainstream media, so I find this fascinating. And if you want to bash the mainstream media, go right ahead. But what does it get wrong still when it decides to cover it, I guess?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't know. I feel like I don't have like... I think I mean, there's still just this hangover, right, from like all the problems that happened like from 22 and onwards, and so I use my just my parents' litmus test, right? They're like pretty unplugged in people when it comes to this, and their memories and their takes are often just the result of big news items that they saw from maybe years ago, and so this is where I think in some ways making Web3 like kind of boring like is good in a way, right? I mean, we want it to be just like the right tool for the job in all of these different like cases, and just like using that tool more, and then it becomes boring, but it becomes big and like better at the same time.
Mm-hmm. What news sources do you use for your crypto news? Curious.
Podcasts. Yeah,
Podcasts?
Yeah.
All right, that's good for me.
I'll have to start listening to yours.
There you go. All right, give it up for Derek, everybody. Thank you so much.